Summit. Now I want to introduce to stage one of our students at the College of Charleston, Avery Nye. She is a communication major, and so she minors in women and gender studies, and she will introduce our next guest.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joseph Nye. Dr. Nye is a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State of Security Assurance, Science and Technology. He also served as a board member of the East-West Institute, founded and led by John Morose. Dr. Nye has written many influential books, out of which his best known are books on soft power and complex interdependence. He is the author of 15 books and more than 150 articles in professional and policy journals. Dr. Nye is considered one of our top most influential scholars on American foreign policy and one of the top 100 global thinkers. Among his many accolades, in my eyes, I'd say his most influential position has been being the best grandfather to myself and 8 others. It feels funny to refer to him as Dr. Nye, as I've grown up calling him Joe Fish. When I was little, I just thought Joe Fish had a lot of friends in a lot of countries. Please help me welcome Dr. Joe Nye.
Thank you, Avery, for this nice introduction, and thank you all for joining us here tonight in person or remotely. I'm going to start with a couple of questions for you, Professor Nye. And then we will open the floor for Q&A from the audience. Those of you who are connecting remotely will be able to use the chat feature to ask questions. Professor Nye, thank you and welcome to the College of Charleston. You've been an inspiration to David mentioned that you've been an inspiration to him. You've been an inspiration to so many people around the world, so many students and scholars and policymakers who try to understand the world and try to understand relations between different countries. When I first came to the US 22 years ago as a graduate student, I was interested in business. I thought I was going to be a businessman. And then I decided to take a political science course, the Politics of Globalization. One of the assigned books was an edited volume, and the first chapter was authored by you and Robert Cohen. And this is exactly the same book from my bookshelf that I rarely dispose of books. One of the first chapter was by you and Robert Cohen. You wrote about the dimensions of globalization, global governance, thick and thin globalism, the declining power of nation states, soft power and transnational issues crossing international borders. And that was my first introduction to your writing. Fast forward 20 years, I teach about global challenges. I teach about the world. In my introduction to international studies, last week, we finished the section on the dimensions of globalization and the interconnected nature of the world. So you started talking about globalization in the 1970s as a complex interdependence. Last year, you wrote in response to a more pessimistic view on globalization, and you argued that globalization is not over despite all the disruptions caused by the pandemic, by the Russian war, and by the changes in China. How have your thoughts about globalization evolved over the past decades? Where are we today trying to understand this phenomenon?
Well, thank you very much, Max. It's a pleasure to be here at the College of Charleston. Before I answer your good question, let me say that I want to pay tribute to John Rose, and the founder of at least the person in whose honor your institute is named. He was not only a friend, but he was also one of the best public service entrepreneurs I've ever known. He created a public institute for getting Russians and Eastern Europeans and Americans to talk to each other at the heart of the Cold War. And I think, yeah, John, I'm delighted that you have this institute in his name. On globalization, you know, to some extent, there's now an argument that globalization is a bad word. Some people are saying they're globalists and localists, and the globalists are bad. You know, globalization is simply a fact. There are aspects of it which are good and aspects of it which are bad. But it's a product of technology. I mean, if globalization is the interdependence across continental different distances, you know, we've had that to some extent since Marco Polo and the trade routes that link China and Europe. But the point is now you have this extraordinary ability to link anywhere in the world instantaneously just by pulling your cell phone out of your pocket. That's not going away. So when people say, well, globalization is going away or we've outgrown it because of the conflicts we have today, no, I mean, this is just a fact of life. There's some people who say, well, but look at the tensions that have grown between the US and China, and we're cutting back on trade with China. But notice that that decoupling, as it's called, is very limited. We have what you might call selective decoupling in areas which are very important to security, such as chips, and that's a good thing. But we don't have general decoupling from China. We in China have nearly $500 billion of trade. And if you tried to decouple all that, you would have a devastating effect on the Chinese economy, but also on the American economy and on the world economy. And so when you look at the overall figures, yes, sales of computer chips are to China are definitely down. But if you look at all trade between the US and China, it's maybe down somewhere in the range of 10 or 15%. So I think whether we like globalization or don't like globalization, it's a fact, and we're going to have to learn to live with it. So the worst thing is to treat it as, oh, it's an ideology or a belief system. It's not. It's just a fact of what technology has done.
Thank you. I want to move to the question on China, U.S.-China relations. You suggested your topic, the topic that you suggested for your presentation for the fireside chat is about the possibility of conflict with China, between the U.S. and China. As Chinese power, economic and military power, has been expanding, some people have been worried that the Chinese power or China can become more assertive in its foreign policy. It can become a revisionist power. And as a revisionist power, it can disrupt the world global order and threaten American interests. Some argue that conflict is bound to happen. You have been writing that conflict between the US and China is not inevitable. What makes you optimistic about US-China relations? What do our leaders need to do to avoid conflict? And what do Chinese leaders need to do?
Well, I have a friend at Harvard, Graham Allison, who's written a book with the title Destined for War. And even though we're great friends and we go fishing together for salmon in Alaska, so there's some things we agree on Destined for War, we disagree. I think we can manage the relationship to avoid war, but you can never rule something out. In other words, humans make mistakes. We can make mistakes. But if you ask why would he think we're destined for war, he cites the case of the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC, where the Greek city-state system tore itself apart with the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides, the famous historian who described this, said the war was caused not by a particular set of incidents, but by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. In other words, it was inevitable that the rising power would create fear in the established power and that would lead to war. And he called that the Thucydides trap. I think that that's not necessarily true, and that we can manage that. And one of the reasons I believe so is that I don't see China passing the US. It's now already slowing down in terms of its economic growth. It had fantastic economic growth and did a great job of raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty with double-digit growth. But it's now down in the single digits, low single digits in its growth rate. And people say, oh, that's just temporary because of the, getting over COVID, or they have a property bust now and an overinflated property market and so forth. I think it's deeper than that. If you look at the long term for China, they are suffering demographic decline. Their population and their labor force peaked in 2015. So instead of this great flow of labor coming from the countryside into the cities and producing this huge growth that you had in the last 2 or 3 decades, that slowed. And you say, well, but economists will tell you there's an answer to that slowing of labor. When you don't have enough labor, you substitute technology, and that productivity then makes up for the missing labor. The trouble with that for China is that its total factor productivity has been going down, not up. And they say, well, but won't they be able to introduce new technologies? They're doing well in some technologies, but they're putting too much emphasis on state-owned enterprises and the Communist Party having complete control of them. And in some ways, it's the private enterprises which are the geese that lay the golden eggs. And when Xi Jinping is insisting on tight party control of private enterprises, that's killing those geese that lay the golden eggs. So my projection, people have said, oh, China will pass the United States by 2030. My view is probably not. But even if they do, there's a big difference between the US and China. China has allies such as Russia and North Korea. Russia is about 1/10 the size of China. North Korea is an impoverished state. US has allies all over the world. In Europe, in NATO, and in East Asia itself, we have alliances with Japan and with South Korea and Australia. And when you add together the wealth or product of the American alliances and the Chinese alliances, we're about 3 to 1. And if we maintain our alliances, I don't see how China is ever going to prevail. So this fear that's supposed to have been or should be created by the rising China is not a fear we have to succumb to. But, and here's why you can't rule something out, if we make dumb remarks and do dumb things, we can essentially destroy those alliances. So to make comments like, we don't care what Putin does, and we're not going to protect allies who aren't spending enough, that destroys the credibility of our alliances, not just in Europe and in Asia. That's handing a gift to the Chinese. And so in many ways, you could say that if you were a creature from Mars and you came down and looked at this contest between the Americans and the Chinese on Earth, and you say, this is a high stakes poker game, who's going to win? And you could peer over their shoulders and see what hands they held. You say, oh my God, the Americans have a much higher hand than the Chinese, which is what I just described. But depends on whether we play our cards well. If we discard our aces, we can still lose that game. Undoing our alliances in the name of domestic politics at home, and we see that now in the failure of the House of Representatives to pass the aid to Ukraine because of domestic politics, which then has a ripple effect on credibility of the United States in Asia as well as in Europe. Or if we cut down on immigration, which is a great hot button issue in the United States now. But if you look at the net effect of immigration, it's one of the reasons we don't have demographic decline while China does. And, there are things we should do to manage immigration better. But again, domestic politics has gotten in the way. There was a compromise in the Senate of how to pass a comprehensive immigration law, and it was basically scotched in the House because of the domestic politics. So I would argue that we're not destined for war. I don't see China passing us unless we do some stupid things to ourselves, like discard the aces that we hold in our hand. And I'd like to tell you that's impossible, but you all know better than that.
I feel like one of the aces is soft power that you have been theorizing for the last 30 years or so. You introduced the term soft power in 1990 in response to a seeming decline of the United States, of the US economic and military power, particularly in its relationship to Japan and the rise of Japanese power. Since then, the world has changed quite a bit, and so we have been witnessing the collapse of the USSR, the rise of China, the rise of Russia, the more assertive Russia, the expansion of the European Union, and then alternative sources of power emerged, BRICS, among them China. And so as China reemerged as this, and you're writing that China reemerged rather than emerged as a power. So as it reemerged into a major and military and economic power, is it threatening U.S. soft power today or U.S. power? How do you view American soft power today? And do you think if our power of persuasion and attraction is strong, is it declining? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's an important question. Soft power means the ability to get others to do what you want. And soft power is the ability to do that by attraction rather than coercion or payment. So we think of sticks and carrots as the way most people think about power, which I call hard power. You can measure the GDP, as I was suggesting. You can measure the size of the military. And in 1989, I was writing a book basically to refute the great British historian Paul Kennedy, who'd written a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which made the New York Times bestseller list. And he said that the United States is going the way of Philip II Spain or Edwardian England, were in decline. I thought this was wrong. And so I was trying to total up American hard power, the carrots and the sticks. And I said, there's still something missing in terms of the American ability to get others to do what we want. And that's attraction. And power is not just coercion and payment, it's also attraction. Or to use that metaphor of carrots and sticks and extend it, you got to add magnets. So carrots and sticks are important, that's hard power. But if you have a magnetic effect, you can save a lot on carrots and sticks. And so I introduced this idea of soft power to drive people to take a broader perspective on what power was about. One of the things that intrigued me was that I used the concept or invented it, sitting at our kitchen table in Massachusetts, trying to write notes for this book. This is pre-computer. And I never thought the idea would take off and have legs, so to speak. One of the biggest surprises when in 2007, Hu Jintao, then the president of China, told the 17th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party that they had to invest more in their soft power. And I thought, wow, that concept has come a long way from the kitchen table. But it did mean that the Chinese started to invest heavily in their efforts to become more attractive or more magnetic. I even had the Chinese foreign minister ask me to have a one-on-one dinner with him when I was in Beijing so that he could ask me how they could increase their soft power. But basically, the US has certain advantages in soft power that the Chinese are going to find hard to repair or to emulate. And one is that they have conflicts with a lot of their neighbors. We don't. I mean, Mexico and Canada, we have some conflicts, but they're trivial. China has conflicts with India, which is now larger than China in population. And it's very hard to set up a Confucius Institute to teach the glories of Chinese culture to make China look more attractive in New Delhi if you have Chinese troops on the border in the Himalayas killing Indian troops. That's they need to, in Asia, they need to overcome these conflicts with their neighbors. And the other problem they have is a lot of a country's soft power or attractiveness grows out of its civil society, not just its government. And in the United States, a lot of our soft power comes from our universities, it comes from our foundations, it comes from Hollywood, and so forth. And in China, they're afraid of letting their civil society go free. In a sense, the insistence on tight party control of everything means that you can't benefit from the civil society. So, for example, you have a great artist like Ai Weiwei, who's the man who developed the famous bird's nest dome for the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. And but he had independent views, and he was once jailed and now exiled. Well, that's not the way to increase your soft power. So in that sense, I think the Chinese have a problem of building their soft power. If you look at whether that's true or not, you can look at good independent polls, which ask people in different countries, which country do you find more attractive? And there you'll find the United States outranks China in most countries in Asia, Europe, Latin America. The one area of the world where we're more or less tied is in Africa. But the Americans are well ahead in soft power, again, unless we do something stupid.
I want to ask you about the U.S., the role of the U.S. in maintaining global world order or global order. It seems like world order is a recurring theme in your writing, and we have been debating, academics and policymakers, about the role of the U.S. Should the U.S. be more engaged? Should it be engaged in building alliances, act as a leader? Others argue that we should be looking inward at our domestic problems, at our border, at our economic concerns. Some suggested the U.S. should take a more transactional look at relationships with partners around the world and disengage essentially from the rest of the world. What is your vision about the role of the U.S. in the world?
Well, if you look at public opinion polls, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has been surveying American opinion since the 1970s in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And what is found is about a third, or 30% to be more precise, of Americans want just to stay at home. Why should we go out and be involved in the rest of the world? But somewhere around 60% plus want to have an active foreign policy. Right now, we're going through a period where that stay-at-home idea, isolationism, populist isolationism, is increasing again. So the 30% is going to be increasing, and we're going to hear more of it in the 2024 election campaign. The problem with that approach is obviously we have to take care of problems at home, but presumably a country that's the richest country in the world can do both, and that it doesn't have to say it's either or. If you look at what happens in the world where the largest country doesn't take the initiative in trying to create institutions and principles for global order, it becomes quite chaotic, and that can be quite destructive. I mean, we went through a period like that in the 1930s. Remember, isolationism in the 30s, American isolationism was, 80% of the people or more. I know I've written this memoir, which we have a copy of down there, which confesses that my own family was isolationist. And so it's not, we've been there and done that. But the problem is what resulted from that isolationism. It was World War II, which killed tens of millions of people, including, nearly 500,000 Americans. So the idea that we can turn inward and, just take care of our own problems flies in the face of history, also flies in the face of where we started this conversation. World's getting technologically a lot more interconnected. If we're worried today about Russia putting a nuclear weapon in space, which could destroy all our satellite communications, the idea that you can just hide behind two oceans and good relations with Canada and Mexico, you're missing something. Not only to mention the proper things that David was talking about in the first presentation, which is with the internet, you can't retreat behind borders because the internet crosses borders.
What keeps you up at night when you think about international relations?
A lot of things. Right now, the two things that keep me up are the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And the idea that we may back away from supporting the Ukrainians and that Putin can carry out this aggression and succeed, I think will be very damaging to us as well as to Ukraine and as well as to the world order we talked about. So that one worries me. And the other one that worries me is this Gaza war, where you see this, the Hamas terrorists committed a huge atrocity of killing 1,200 women, children, and innocent civilians on October 7th. But as Israel responds, it's got a deep problem because the terrorists are interlinked with the civilian population, but they haven't done enough to protect the civilian population. If you're killing something like 20,000 or 30,000, somewhere in that range, there's something wrong with this picture. If you think about the ethics of war under just war theory, which goes back to St. Augustine, and which was secularized and codified as the Uniform Code of Military Justice and International Humanitarian Law. It says that you should never target civilians on purpose. And then you say, but what happens if I kill some civilians by accident, so-called collateral damage? And there, the answer is there has to be proportionality. If you kill a few, that could be seen as collateral damage that's proportional. If you kill tens of thousands of civilians, you're violating this principle of proportionality. And I think that's where you're seeing so much reaction against Israeli policy now. The Israelis are stuck in the sense that there are tunnels which the terrorists have built under hospitals. On the other hand, and therefore, as you go in to clean these out, to respond to the atrocity that Hamas committed on October 7th, there's bound to be collateral damage. But there's a difference between that and dropping 1,000-pound bombs in the middle of civilian residences. And so that keeps me up at night. I mean, I'm a supporter of Israel, but I wish the Netanyahu government had a better strategy.
Thank you for this. I want to end on a positive, optimistic note. What kind of advice would you give to your 20-year-old self? What kind of advice would you give to our students as our students are preparing to embark look for their first jobs, internships? What kind of skills do they need today to succeed in this interconnected world?
Well, the most important trait, which is not a skill, but a trait, which I hope you have developed during your time at the College of Charleston, is curiosity. Be open to the rest of the world. Let things interest you. It's very easy to narrow down, but if you keep saying, gosh, there's some really interesting things out there, and I wish I understood them better. I wish I could, understand that or do that. Then to realize that if you want to know what it means to be an American, it helps to know non-Americans. And that can be either from having foreign students here in the college that you can interact with. It can also be spending time abroad, traveling abroad, or even better yet, spending some time living abroad. So you think about the wider world, because to go back to where we started, Max, you're not going to escape the rest of the world. You may not be interested in the rest of the world. The rest of the world, however, is interested in you, for better and for worse. So think about this broader aspect of life. Let your curiosity roam and learn what it means to be a good American by interacting with non-Americans. And that's at a very general level of advice, but that's I think the level that is probably most applicable to all 20-year-olds.
Thank you very much. Now it's a good time to open the floor to questions and answers. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we have a couple of microphones here. And for our online audience, please submit your questions through the chat feature.
Dr. Nye, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you said, and lots of things keep me awake. One of which is having read Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire for my classes' friends. But I wanted to ask about, with the upcoming presidential election, I feel that we're in a position where our allies don't trust us and our enemies sort of jeer at us. Oversimplification, but the past two administrations have been sort of categorized as weak and foolish and frighteningly aggressive and foolish. And I wonder what you would say about a candidate coming in 2024, what the most important role for them to play or area to emphasize with all of this conflict going on. And thank you.
Well, thank you for a good hard question. I think the important thing is to realize that there are going to be major challenges out there, that it's not going to be an easy world. And in that sense, what David Hickton described is accurate. And the question then is, do you have a strategy for dealing with that? And a strategy, let's take the case of China. Strategy for China means that you have to realize the Chinese are going to be there. We're not going to get rid of that problem. On the other hand, if we let it degenerate into a war, that's going to be bad for us as well as bad for them. And so the question is, can you manage this strategic competition? And that's going to require carrots and sticks and magnets. And I find, and David said this earlier, I think the people who are doing China policy in the Biden administration, like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Kurt Campbell, who's the head of policy on Asia in the White House, who was once my deputy when I was in the Pentagon. I think they know what they're doing. And I think they're balancing this sweet and sour, tough and soft, if you want, pretty well. I worry about what we're seeing from the Trump camp, or his part of the Republican Party, not all Republicans, but his part. There's very little nuance or subtlety there. And it's hard to see a real strategy. I mean, how do you, if your goal is to have a managed competition, I see the competition, I don't see the management.
هذا أنت تترك نكهة تنير الطريق ليشرق حلمك ويستفيق، تسجل وصفة للنجاح تعيدها بشغف كل صباح. البنك العربي، الوصول بداية.
Thank you. Hi, David Merkel. Thank you very much, Professor. I'm tempted to ask you about your famous Rhodes Scholar colleague, but instead I want to ask you about peak China. Hal Brands wrote an article in Foreign Policy where he seemed to agree that China wouldn't overtake the United States, but after planning for the great rejuvenation, after building towards it, that perhaps recognition that China will not grow larger than the United States may lead to war, as was the case with Germany in World War I. So I'd love to hear your comments about that.
Well, it's an interesting point, and Hal Brands, who is a very interesting historian, has said if he and I agree, let's say in contrast to Graham Allison, that China is not going to overtake the United States, maybe instead of relaxing about that, we should say, but the Chinese will say we're going to miss our window of opportunity. And for particularly on issues like Taiwan, where China regards Taiwan as a renegade province. And when Kissinger and Nixon met with Mao Zedong in '72, they couldn't agree on Taiwan. And so they decided to kick the can down the road, so to speak, by declaring or agreeing to a one China policy. What they said was Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits agree that there is one China, and we, the United States, will adhere to that. So we have said there is one China, which means we will not recognize a separate de jure Taiwan. We can help protect Taiwan to defend itself. We said no formal independence, no use of force. But Xi Jinping has told the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese People's Liberation Army that he wants to be able to take over Taiwan by 2027. And so if you go to Hal Brands's point, if he thinks it's onward and upward forever for China, then he can put this off forever, and eventually Taiwan will fall in his lap. If he believes that China's power has peaked and he still has this objective of recovering Taiwan, he said, I better act now, 2025 or 26, because things are not getting better for me. They're going to get worse in terms of the balance of power. So that's the gist of his argument. It's not a trivial argument. I don't dismiss it, but I just don't think that the Chinese can do that. I don't think. I mean, if Putin had trouble with invading Ukraine with a massed land army right against the Ukrainian border, it's a lot harder to cross 100 miles of seawater with an amphibious force. And if you try that and fail, then she would be jeopardizing the thing he cares about most, which is his control of the Communist Party and the Communist Party's control of China. So even though there might be a window of opportunity closing, which makes him take higher risks than he otherwise would, I don't think he wants to take the risk of losing control of the Communist Party or the Communist Party's control of China. So I think Hal Brands makes a valid point. I don't feel as alarmed by it as he does.
Professor Nye, thank you for a wonderful advice and counsel. We appreciate it so much. One of the words that has not been used is nationalism, the nation state. And as an advocate of globalization, I think the resurgence of nationalism, and to use yet another expression of it, conservative nationalism, where you're combining not only an emphasis on the importance of the nation state itself or the nation, but also combining a religious component, perhaps an ethnic, racial component. Do you see the resurgence of nationalism as a serious threat or just an indulgence?
Well, it's an important question. A little bit of nationalism is a good thing. It pulls people together. It ties us together to be nationalistic about being American, or British about being British, or French, and so forth. It's when it gets out of control and it becomes exclusive that it becomes dangerous. And there's an interesting article in the current issue of the London Economist, which I find is the most valuable source of anything I read. It's tough going, but it's got good stuff. And the cover is about what they call the rise of NatCons. NatCons are nationalist conservatives based on populism. So it's this very exclusive type of nationalism that you were alluding to. And we can see it in the United States. You can see it in Britain, where the Brexit movement was based on it. You can see it in France, where Marine Le Pen represents a similar group. You can even see it in Scandinavia, in Sweden, you have the Swedish Democrats, which are NatCons, which get about 20% of the vote. So the Economist makes the argument that you're seeing the rise of populist nationalism and that it is very dangerous. I agree with that. So I think nationalism is not bad per se. But a little nationalism goes a long way. And too much goes over the top.
Chloe, do we have any questions from the webinar?
Yes, we have one. Professor Nye, as the U.S. has the largest defense budget in the world, do we need to significantly increase the budget for the State Department in order to achieve a better balance between soft power and hard power?
Well, I'm torn on this because I served in both the State Department and the Defense Department. And when you work in those two huge bureaucracies, you notice the difference that the budgets make. We definitely should increase the budget for the State Department. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates once gave a speech in which he said that as Secretary of Defense, he would increase the budget of the Department of State. And I agree with Bob Gates on that. I think that I'm not one for cutting the defense budget unless I could cut it just in the ways I want, and Congress would never allow that. But I would say that we're not investing enough in our diplomacy and soft power capabilities in the State Department.
Thank you, Dr. Nye. I had read your works back when I was a college student. That was a number of decades ago, so it's a real honor to have you visit the College of Charleston today. I wanted to pick up on your remark to a prior question. One of our presidential candidates is likely to take a view of all relationships are zero-sum games, and he specifically demagogues on the issue of trade goods imbalances with China, where we give them $300 billion and they give us $50 billion year after year. If you could take us back to school and provide a good persuasive populist argument against that thinking, I think we'd all appreciate it.
Well, most economists would say that looking at the trade balance is not the best way to understand the benefits of trade. In other words, in our trade relations with China, we may have a deficit, but we may have other countries with which we have a surplus. And if you look at the benefits which we get from trade, the last thing we want to do is to get down to an equal, I won't trade with you unless you trade exactly the same amount with me. And that is, economics 101. Very hard to beat that when you're on the campaign trail, where domestic politics 101 says, raise the flag, anathematize the enemy, blame the foreigner. And so taking that basic insight from economics and explaining it on the stump when you're giving a speech that's why some people are skilled politicians and I'm not.
Hi, Dr. Nye. Thank you for being here and speaking with us. My name is Sid Jackson. I'm one of the international scholars. I wanted to ask you a question more directed toward the growing relationship between China and some countries in the Middle East. Last semester, I conducted an independent study with Dr. Brown, and we were looking at the growing allyship between China, Saudi Arabia, on the basis of economic and developmental policies and also their foreign policy interest. And with the Israel-Hamas conflict now going on, it's even further weakening our soft power and our foreign policy interests in the region. So is there any specific strategies or things you feel like we can do to combat China in the Middle East?
Well, China has been increasing its diplomatic presence in the Middle East, but it's still not a nearly as major a factor as the U.S. It has been working more closely with Iran and buying Iranian oil, which is under U.S. sanctions, and a lot of it's smuggled through a so-called ghost fleet of tankers. And so in that sense, it has been increasing its influence in Iran. It did work a bit with the Saudis to try to alleviate the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but it can't have it both ways. I mean, the Saudis and the Iranians are intense competitors for who's going to be the major power of the Persian Gulf. And by having cast its lot with Iran to the extent it has, its influence in Saudi Arabia has gone down somewhat. Also, the Saudis and the U.S. have been working more closely. They were not working closely when the Biden administration first came in. They are now. And it's interesting that when President Biden has said to the Israelis, to the Netanyahu government, you have to have a positive vision for the future of the Palestinian issue. And your idea that you've been pursuing of just quietly eroding the Palestinians on the West Bank and cooping them up in Gaza, we're never going to return to that. And therefore, we need a two-state vision of the future of the Middle East or the Israel-Palestine issue. And that's not popular in Israel, particularly in the traumatic aftermath of October 7th. But guess who's helped the Americans on that? Saudi Arabia. For years, the Saudis didn't want to do something which inflamed their domestic opinion by recognizing Israel. But now the Saudis have said that if there's a serious path to a two-state solution, they will recognize Israel. That's something in which American diplomacy in the region, along with Saudis, makes a big difference. China doesn't have that kind of relationship. Doesn't mean that everything is fine. There is intense competition, but again, I think the American position is stronger.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up our discussion. I want to invite everyone. First of all, I want to thank Professor Nye for this insightful discussion. Thank you very much for your comments, for your questions, for your answers. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I want to invite all of you to come back tomorrow at 7:45. We start serving breakfast over here in this auditorium. And we're going to continue with remarks from President Xu, Provost Austin, and Dean Arias at 8:30. And we have 4 fantastic panels planned for you tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a good night.